The trading floor buzzed with energy until silence fell as red numbers splashed across giant screens. Michael Turner, a 42-year-old entrepreneur, stared at the collapse of his empire. The narrator whispered that billions were vanishing in seconds. Michael said, "This can't be real, it's impossible." His sidekick Daniel, 39, rushed forward, whispering that investors were panicking and banks were cutting lines of credit. The world outside seemed normal, but inside the glass tower, the air grew suffocating. Employees whispered with dread, while phones rang unanswered. Sarah Collins, 35, the loyal whistleblower, clenched a folder that could change everything. The building lights flickered, as if the walls themselves trembled with the weight of betrayal. The narrator noted that somewhere in the shadows, Edward Grant, 50, the ruthless antagonist, smiled coldly, pulling invisible strings. The collapse had only just begun. The narrator explained how silence became terror as the first investor pulled out. Michael's hands trembled over his desk, staring at the balance sheet showing empty accounts. He whispered, "They've taken everything." Daniel urged him to call the bank, but his voice cracked with fear. Sarah lingered nearby, holding her folder tighter, knowing it contained truths no one wanted exposed. Phones rang, but no one answered. The office, once filled with ambition, now felt like a coffin. The narrator noted that the collapse was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated downfall. The narrator described how whispers turned into accusations. Employees muttered about betrayal, some pointing fingers at Michael while others packed their bags in silence. Michael said, "I never saw this coming." Daniel grabbed his shoulder and told him to fight back. The whistleblower, Sarah's eyes darted, knowing her secrets could change the outcome, but fearing the consequences. Fear filled the glass tower, heavier than the air conditioning hum. The narrator revealed how panic spread like wildfire. A junior analyst shouted that millions were gone overnight, and tension cracked like thunder in the glass walls. Michael slammed his desk and shouted, "This company was my life." His voice echoed with desperation. Daniel tried to calm him, urging restraint, but his words barely registered. Sarah's grip tightened on her folder until her knuckles whitened, her decision still unmade. The narrator whispered that in another room untouched by chaos, Edward Grant watched with cold satisfaction. He leaned back in his leather chair, murmuring, "Every empire falls." His eyes reflected greed and triumph. Michael's empire was his masterpiece of destruction. Phones buzzed in the distance as he sipped whiskey slowly, savoring victory. The collapse of Turner Enterprises was not chance, but design, and the game had only just begun. The narrator described the crowded shareholder meeting, where tension filled the air like smoke. Michael Turner stood at the podium, his face pale and drawn. He said, "I promise you this company can survive." Angry voices rose from the crowd, shouting accusations. Daniel whispered from the side, urging him to stay calm. A man in the back shouted that millions were gone. The atmosphere cracked like glass, every word heavy with blame. Sarah, sitting quietly, studied Michael's trembling hands, her folder resting on her lap. The narrator explained that trust, once broken, was impossible to restore. Edward's invisible hand made sure of it. The narrator revealed how Michael's calls to banks were met with silence and rejection. He slammed the receiver down, muttering, "They've turned their backs on me." Daniel leaned in, saying they needed options before the company crumbled. Sarah watched quietly, biting her lip, the folder still clutched in her arms. Outside the window, the city glowed indifferent, as if mocking his desperation. The narrator noted that Michael was a leader stripped of his lifeline, his pride crumbling with each refusal. No loan, no survival. The empire he built was collapsing brick by brick. The narrator whispered that secrets were surfacing. Sarah approached Michael hesitantly, saying, "I've seen records. There's something you need to know." His eyes narrowed with fear, sensing the truth he ignored. Daniel shifted uneasily, whispering they had no time for distractions. The folder in Sarah's hands felt heavier than steel, a weapon of truth. Her expression showed the weight of betrayal uncovered. The narrator explained that within those papers lay names, numbers, and evidence too explosive to hide. The question was whether Michael had the courage to open it. The narrator spoke of an old voice returning. Jonathan Pierce, the fallen mentor, stepped into the office, his once proud figure bent by failure. At 58, his hair gray and suit worn, he said, "I've walked this path before. Be ruthless or be crushed." Michael stared at him, torn between admiration and disgust. Daniel muttered that trusting him was dangerous. Sarah looked away, knowing Jonathan's words carried scars of corruption. The narrator explained that advice born of ruin carried poison, but Michael was desperate enough to drink it. The narrator explained how Daniel fought to steady the storm. He sat across from Michael, his voice calm but firm. "We still have loyal staff. We can regroup," he said. Michael rubbed his temples, whispering, "Everything is slipping away." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her silence screaming louder than words. Jonathan smirked, sipping coffee, his eyes glinting with cynicism. The office lights buzzed faintly, flickering like the company's future. The narrator whispered that hope was shrinking, but Daniel clung to it, refusing to surrender. His loyalty was both strength and burden. The narrator described the suffocating air of the investor meeting. Michael sat across from a wealthy backer whose cold stare cut deeper than words. The investor snapped without drastic action, "I'll withdraw everything." Michael's heart pounded as the room closed in on him. Daniel whispered, urging him to resist such blackmail. The investor tapped his pen, a slow rhythm of dominance. Sarah, seated at the back, lowered her gaze, knowing Michael's survival depended on this man's greed. The narrator explained that in that moment, Michael wasn't negotiating a deal, he was pleading for his life's work to breathe another day. The narrator revealed how chaos spread through the office corridors. Employees whispered accusations, blaming Michael for every lost cent. One shouted, "He destroyed us." Another packed files into boxes without looking back. Michael said, "I fought for this company. I never betrayed it." Daniel's voice cracked, telling him not to lose control. Sarah lingered by the door, folder tight in her arms, watching loyalty collapse into ashes. The narrator explained that once faith dies in a leader, fear fills the gap, and fear was now their only language. The narrator described how Edward Grant twisted the knife. From his penthouse office he whispered into a phone, instructing traders to crash Turner Enterprises further. He smirked, saying, "Finish the job." Michael across town felt invisible walls closing around him. The market's cruel rhythm wasn't chance, it was sabotage. Daniel shouted that numbers were falling faster than forecasts. Sarah pressed her lips shut, knowing the evidence in her folder explained everything. The narrator explained that Michael's company wasn't failing by accident, it was being strangled in real time. The narrator told of pain beyond boardrooms. At a modest suburban home, Michael's sister Anna wept over a foreclosure notice. Anna, 37, said he promised would be safe. Her children clung to her arms as she trembled. Michael stared at the letter later that night, guilt etching deeper lines into his face. Daniel said softly, "This isn't your fault," but Michael shook his head in silence. The narrator whispered that financial collapse wasn't only numbers on a screen. It was lives torn apart, and Anna had just become another victim of Edward's greed. The narrator described Sarah's discovery. Late at night, she pored over confidential documents, her eyes wide with horror. She whispered, "This is bigger than we thought." Her hands shook as pages revealed fraudulent transfers tied directly to Edward Grant. The folder became a torch in darkness, each page a dagger against corruption. Michael's future, his company, and countless lives rested on whether she spoke out. The narrator explained that Sarah had uncovered the weapon that could shatter Edward's empire, but truth was as dangerous as silence. The narrator revealed how Jonathan Pierce finally shared his past sins. Sitting in Michael's office, his voice cracked as he said, "I once chased power until it consumed me. I lost everything." Michael stared at him with a mixture of pity and fear, knowing this confession mirrored his own path. Daniel crossed his arms, muttering that Jonathan's wisdom was poisoned by failure. Sarah studied the older man's weary eyes, realizing that behind his warnings was a ghost of ambition destroyed. The narrator explained that Jonathan's truth was not advice, but a grim reflection of Michael's future if he chose the same path. The narrator explained how Michael uncovered records of massive embezzlement, hidden deep in the company's accounts. Alone in his office, he whispered, "This can't be true." His trembling hands traced figures that bled like wounds across the pages. Daniel entered quietly, gasping at the evidence of stolen millions. Sarah, summoned soon after, clenched her jaw, recognizing the familiar signatures. The narrator whispered that these documents were more than numbers. They were a dagger pointing directly at Edward Grant. Truth was now visible, but it was also a dangerous burden. The narrator described how Sarah finally opened her folder before Michael and Daniel. Her voice steady, she said, "It was never a mistake. It was sabotage. Edward engineered it all." Michael staggered back, disbelief tightening his chest. Daniel slammed his fist against the table, shouting that Edward would pay. The room felt heavier as Sarah's words filled it with a truth too sharp to ignore. The narrator explained that betrayal had worn many masks, but now the villain's face was clear. Edward had orchestrated the collapse with meticulous cruelty. The narrator explained how loyalty cracked under the weight of truth. Daniel's voice trembled as he told Michael, "You should have seen this coming." Michael shouted, "I trusted everyone." His voice broke, echoing through the glass walls. Sarah lowered her head, her silence carrying both guilt and vindication. Jonathan, leaning in the doorway, smirked bitterly, reminding them that trust was currency no one could afford. The narrator whispered that even allies can become adversaries when the foundation of faith begins to crumble. The narrator described how the investor finally revealed his motives. Meeting Michael in private, he leaned back in his chair, saying coldly, "You were always just a pawn. I never invested in you. I invested in your downfall." Michael's hands clenched into fists, rage boiling beneath his despair. Sarah looked on with wide eyes, realizing betrayal came from every direction. Daniel whispered that the investor had played them all. The narrator whispered that greed was not partnership, it was hunger, and Michael was the feast. The narrator revealed how the curtain was torn away. In a tense confrontation, Sarah laid out documents proving Edward orchestrated the collapse. She said firmly, "It was always him." Michael's chest tightened as reality broke through denial. Daniel's fists shook with rage, whispering that Edward had turned the company into his chessboard. Jonathan muttered bitterly that the game had always been rigged. The narrator explained that betrayal was no longer rumor or suspicion. It was a revelation, cutting away the last illusions Michael had left. The narrator described Anna Turner's voice cracking in court as she filed her lawsuit. She said, "My family has lost everything." Michael sat in the gallery, his head bowed, shame burning through him. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder, sealing her words into record. Daniel leaned forward, whispering that the damage was spreading beyond repair. Sarah's heart ached as she watched innocence turned into collateral. The narrator explained that even family had become victims of Edward's design, but the pain fell squarely on Michael's shoulders. The narrator explained how Sarah returned late at night, dropping a stack of hidden ledgers onto Michael's desk. She said softly, "This is the proof we need." Michael stared at the numbers, each line an iron chain binding Edward to the fraud. Daniel leaned closer, muttering they finally had a weapon. The pages smelled of ink and dust, but to them it was the scent of salvation. The narrator whispered that in those records was a chance to strike back, though the danger of exposing them grew by the hour. The narrator described Michael's gamble. With everything collapsing, he wired the last of his assets into a volatile investment. He whispered, "This is all or nothing." Daniel shouted that he was insane, but Michael pressed the button anyway, sweat dripping down his face. Sarah grabbed his arm, begging him to stop, but it was too late. Jonathan laughed bitterly, muttering that desperation was the only true currency. The narrator explained that hope had turned reckless, and one risk would either resurrect Michael's empire or bury it forever. The narrator explained how Jonathan's warning cut through the tension. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly, saying, "This gamble cost me everything once, and it will cost you too." Michael glared back, whispering that he had no choice left. Daniel closed his eyes, torn between loyalty and despair. Sarah clenched her fists, knowing the gamble was already sealed. The narrator whispered that the echo of Jonathan's tragedy was now Michael's mirror. The wheel had been spun, and fate was rolling toward its verdict. The narrator described the boardroom showdown. Michael faced Edward across a long polished table, the city skyline glowing behind them. Michael shouted, "You destroyed everything." Edward smirked, replying, "I only exposed your weakness." Daniel leaned forward, his voice trembling as he said, "This isn't negotiation, it's war." Sarah set the folder on the table, her hand shaking as she pushed it toward the center. Jonathan leaned in the corner, muttering that this was the cost of playing with giants. The narrator whispered that the confrontation was no longer about money, it was about survival. The narrator explained how Edward made his move. He slammed down new contracts saying, "Sign and I'll spare what's left." Michael's jaw tightened as he whispered, "You won't own me." Daniel whispered desperately to reconsider. Sarah's heart pounded, her eyes fixed on Edward's smirk. Jonathan chuckled darkly, warning that pride was more expensive than any stock. The narrator revealed that this was not just a legal trap, it was a noose, waiting for Michael's signature to tighten. The narrator described the gamble unfolding. Michael transferred every last resource into a single high-risk move. His hand trembled over the keyboard, whispering, "This is my only chance." Daniel shouted, grabbing his arm, but Michael pressed forward. Sarah cried out that the company couldn't take more losses. Edward sneered, mocking him as reckless. Jonathan muttered, "He's betting on a ghost." The narrator whispered that one keystroke had turned desperation into destiny, and the outcome could not be undone. The narrator revealed the breaking point. Michael staggered as numbers plunged again, his voice cracking. "It's gone." Daniel slammed the desk, shouting in despair. Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Edward laughed coldly, clapping his hands once in triumph. Jonathan whispered that collapse was inevitable for dreamers. The room buzzed with alarms and flashing red screens. The narrator explained that Michael's empire was crumbling in real time, each second a nail in its coffin, and his spirit teetered on the edge of ruin. The narrator described Michael's final outcry. With tears in his eyes, he stood and shouted, "You may take my company, but you'll never take my soul." His voice echoed through the glass walls. Edward's smirk faltered for the first time. Daniel stared at him, torn between admiration and despair. Sarah whispered, "It's not over." Jonathan lowered his gaze, muttering that defiance was all that remained when everything else was lost. The narrator explained that this moment was not triumph nor defeat. It was the raw climax of a man stripped to his essence. The narrator explained how the company's fate was sealed. Turner Enterprises collapsed into bankruptcy, its name splashed across every headline. Michael sat in his office, empty walls echoing the weight of failure. He whispered, "It's over." Daniel stood nearby, his face torn between anger and sorrow. Sarah placed the folder gently on the desk, whispering, "At least the truth will be known." Jonathan looked out the window, muttering that empires fall but scars remain. The narrator revealed that financial ruin was final, but its lessons would haunt every survivor. The narrator described Anna Turner standing outside the courthouse, clutching her children. She said softly, "We will survive this." Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing like lightning. Michael watched from a distance, unable to approach, guilt consuming him. Daniel whispered that Anna's pain was the true cost of the scandal. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, urging him to stay strong. The narrator explained that beyond the numbers and losses, it was families who bore the heaviest weight of betrayal. The narrator explained how Daniel finally confronted his loyalty. Sitting with Michael in a quiet bar, he said, "I believed in you, but I can't keep standing in the fire." Michael nodded silently, his eyes glassy. Sarah joined them, whispering, the truth is still worth fighting for. Jonathan smirked from a corner, muttering that loyalty always has a price. The narrator revealed that the sidekick's faith had fractured, and even friendship was no longer immune to the storm. The narrator revealed how Michael found quiet reflection. Alone in the ruins of the office, he walked through empty cubicles, touching abandoned chairs and desks. He whispered, "This was more than a company. It was my life." Sarah's voice echoed in memory, urging him to see beyond failure. Daniel's words haunted him, warning of the fire they all endured. Jonathan's cynicism lingered like a shadow. The narrator explained that Michael's acceptance was not peace, but the first step toward living with loss. The narrator described Michael's final moment. Standing on a rooftop at sunrise, he looked over the city, whispering, "You can destroy a man's fortune, but not his soul." His eyes glistened with tears, yet a faint smile touched his lips. Edward's empire glittered in the distance, but its shadow no longer held him. Sarah's voice echoed in his heart, promising that truth had power beyond wealth. The narrator explained that the scandal left him broken yet unbowed, a man scarred but still breathing. The story ended, not with victory, but with resilience.